All right, welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have Haoson. Welcome, Haoson.
Thanks for having me, James. Glad to be on the podcast.
No, thanks for coming on. So, if anyone's been listening to the podcast for a while, we've had a couple of Ethos Performance guys on. So we had Mia Orney, he was on quite a few podcasts ago, and then we ended up having Jordan Sullivan as well. He's not employed by Ethos. He works with a lot of the Ethos guys here in terms of their nutrition. And now we have Haoson, who is the sports scientist there. So maybe, Haoson, do you want to dive into a little bit of your background, and then we're going to dive into a lot of different, actionable stats for the fighters listening.
Yeah, very good. So, my background, I started in rugby league. So I did some work with the Cronulla Sharks, started my internship there, learned from sports scientist John Davey, who's still working there at the moment. And he pretty much taught me a lot about how to manipulate data, analyze data, all that kind of stuff. Eventually I got a role there with the Academy Sports Science as Academy Sports Scientist. Unfortunately, COVID had a big impact on that. So then I sort of lost my job, which then led me to Ethos. It was a
as I lost my job too, so it's not uncommon.
So basically, I did an internship at Ethos as well. So the internship program here was really good too. And then at the time, Mia just opened up his gym, and he just coincidentally needed a sports scientist on board. And I've always sort of wanted a job where I could have a bit of both, like coaching. I still coach regularly on the floor, but I also work behind the scenes with the sports science stuff. So, it was sort of like a perfect role for me. And combat sports is, I was involved in it a little bit when I was younger. I did some Muay Thai and stuff, but wasn't, I haven't had any fights or anything, but I just did it for like a bit of fitness. But over the last couple of years, I've definitely dived a lot deeper within the combat sports stuff. Here I am now, employed full-time as both a sports scientist and strength conditioning coach.
Dude, that's awesome, mate. It's not very common to have full-time sports science guys in private, settings in terms of strength conditioning, it's always good to see.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really different in terms of what I experienced in the team sport environment. I feel like I have a lot more flexibility as well now with my work, which is always a bonus in the private sector. So,
for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right. So I want to dive into a little bit of your sports science data. And for anyone listening, some of this might sound a little scientific, but we're going to break it right down to essentially being actionable for you guys listening as well. So a lot of your data is correlational, at least the stuff you send me. You might want to go into other stuff if you have it. But firstly, you've kind of correlated, different tests together, and you've correlated tests by, the martial art, and also tests potentially by level. But do you want to maybe start with a general overview of what a correlation actually is, and what kind of, what information that gives you as a practitioner to have correlations between whether that's levels of fighters or tests and anything like that?
Yeah. So I'll try and break it down in simplest terms, but basically a correlation, you could see it as like a bit of a relationship between two things or variables in more scientific terms. And basically we're looking at different trends. So for example, I think one of the things I sent you was looking at the correlation between the counter movement jump and a trap bar deadlift 3RM, for example. So what we found there is there's a bit of a positive correlation between the counter movement jump, the jump height itself, and also how much the athlete can lift on a 3RM test. The other tests, to be honest, have fairly weak correlations. I think it's in terms of the specificity of the position, probably just doesn't translate well to the sort of key big or traditional big lifts. I found I've been doing a bit more of diving into the data in terms of like looking at some other metrics. One thing that I've been looking at recently is looking at some momentum-based stuff. I know bringing some research around
nice.
in rugby. So I think in terms of like obviously your lighter weight classes are going to have more of those speed characteristics. So they're going to generally achieve higher jump heights compared to someone like Bam Bam Tuivasa, who's obviously a lot heavier in weight, but actually has quite good momentum figures. So, and momentum is basically like, I guess, if you think about, for example, in a takedown in MMA, how much or you're countering the object's resistance. So you want to be able to have the maximum momentum to be able to carry through your takedown in order to finish the takedown and take the person to the ground. So, there's a lot of different metrics that we can talk about further, I guess.
Perfect. We'll come back to momentum, but we'll start with what you mentioned in the beginning, which was the positive correlation between essentially your vertical jump and your trap bar deadlift 3-rep max. So what does that mean for someone listening, that there's a positive correlation between those two lifts? Yep.
So basically, if it's a positive correlation, it means the higher that you can jump, generally we find that the higher numbers of the 3RM that you can achieve in the trap bar deadlift. So that's pretty much what it means there.
So if I'm listening, I go, okay, so if I can jump higher, then I can trap bar deadlift more weight, and vice versa. Like if I trap bar deadlift more weight, I'm probably going to jump higher. How does that, factor into your programming or influence your programming for, combat sports?
Yeah. So with the counter movement jump, we look at, one of the main two metrics we look at the contraction time, so the time to take off. So basically how long you're taking to jump, and also the jump height itself. Yeah. So if the athlete is, taking a long time to jump, then we tend to have more of a velocity based focus for the athlete. So they'll tend to lift at higher velocities. But then we also use things like the isometric mid-fly pull, which is another, test for strength, maximal force output, and also, how fast the athlete can produce the force. So we look at another metric, which is force at 200 milliseconds. And you think about that, that's like less than a second. So it's basically the force they can produce in a very short period of time. And then we look at a percentage of the force at 200 milliseconds compared to their maximal force. And we like to see that at about 50%.
Gotcha.
But in terms of the IMTP, we tend to look at that more as more of a strength focus. So I guess, if the athlete is achieving slightly below average or well below average, then obviously those guys sometimes tend to be beginner sort of combat guys. And then they get more of a force dominant focus. So they'll tend to lift a little bit heavier in the gym. And focus on those more traditional lifts first before progressing to obviously higher velocity lifts closer to their fight camp.
Is there a way maybe for people listening that don't have access to, say, force plates and things like that to do any of this testing, that they can kind of figure out where on the spectrum they should most likely train to improve power outputs within MMA or other combat sports?
Yeah, so I think this comes back to some of the findings that we have with our data. So we tend to find that, so what we do at Ethos is, because we technically don't have enough athletes to sort of divide our data by weight classes and sport specific, because for example, a wrestler cohort might only have, we've got some pretty high level wrestlers here who compete internationally, but we only have 5 of them, so the sample size isn't really too great. So I've sort of combined different disciplines of combat sports together. So that's why I've got things like grappling as one category, MMA as another, and striking based sports. Obviously it's not ideal, but I think it sort of fits what our context is. And basically, so for example, for a grappler, we found that their peak net force output is significantly greater than, say, an MMA fighter or a boxer. Now, I think that's due to the nature of the sport. Obviously, grappling, it's very technical focused, but at the same time, I think the contraction types that you see in grappling are sort of like your longer duration isometric holds, and being able to take someone to the ground requires a fair bit of strength as well, compared to more, if you look at it on the other side of the spectrum with your striking based sports, very velocity, or mostly velocity based focus, and I guess more reactive strength focus, which is another thing we can talk about later in the podcast. But yeah, so back to the question, I guess, if you don't have the resources to sort of test yourself, or find resources like us where you can actually come in for testing, then for grapplers, like if you already, generally we find that grapplers are already strong, so we might have to adapt your training so that you're improving other qualities like power and things like that. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, maybe your striking sports, they're already really fast and reactive already. So we find that they're lacking in a bit more of that strength. So that's where in things like your general prep period, where you can actually do a little bit more work, we can address those weaknesses, and then as we transition closer to the fight camp, or transition closer to the fight, we can make that more back to your strength, which is more velocity-based training.
Nice. I want to come back to your momentum calculation too. So I think that's momentum's obviously, as you mentioned, it's making its way now through the research. More people are using it because it obviously gives more insight into, I guess, how someone's moving in terms of speed, because obviously, as you mentioned, there's weight classes, right? The same thing in rugby. Obviously, you've got big guys in the front row, 120 kilos running X speed, and you've got the backs who are lighter, who are always going to be faster. But you can't really compare that because of the weight difference, whereas momentum obviously kind of negates that weight difference and gives you a value based on their mass. So I guess from that momentum data, how are you using that to influence your programming? And if someone's listening, how can they figure out whether it's, a weight issue or a speed issue in terms of what's going on?
Yeah. So with the momentum calculation, it's basically multiplying your body weight by how quickly you're taking off in the jump. So basically, I guess for your heavier weights, especially, you really need to be able to help them maintain their size, because obviously that's a big part of momentum. So with that in mind, I think the training, especially in that sort of general prep period, that's where you can include more like hypertrophy based exercises to help build some size and keep that lean tissue mass, and then progressively, as they're obviously getting close to the fight camp, they might need to cut down a little bit. In terms of I guess the velocity, again, we use a lot of the velocity based training here at Ethos. So we're working generally at high velocities at the high ends. So we might do things like loaded jumps, like a loaded counter movement jump on a trap bar, generally working at above 1 meters per second. And lately we've been playing around with like peak power as well. So on the flex devices, so I do like a bit of a power profile. We work up to a weight where they achieve that peak power, which is displayed on the device. You get that from a figure from the iPad, and then we can maximize the power output within those exercises as well. So those are just some of the ways that we help athletes to actually maintain their size, and also to train the takeoff velocity as well for the jumps.
Nice. So are you using peak velocity for the jumps, and then average velocity for like squats and things like that, or do you have like a preference in terms of what you like to use?
So sort of at the moment we're still using mean velocity for each, but I think lately I've just been playing around with using peak power, and then trying to figure out try to develop a profile for that, and then work up to a weight that, so I guess in their first week, I guess the best way to sort of use it would be like in their first week, they'd be doing the profile and then the following week they can use those loads to achieve the peak power, which was found in the previous week, and then they can continue the program from there. But basically, I guess it makes sense, like if you're developing power, to be training at peak power. So
nice. So you also mentioned before about the I guess reactive strength. So are you assessing reactive strength, and then if so, I guess how are you training reactive strength that can be used by the people listening, maybe who don't, I guess, have a lot of the equipment, or maybe they're just training at commercial gym or anything like that?
Yep. So with reactive strength, we use the 10-5 RSI test, which is basically 10 pogo jumps. So the athlete performs 10 pogo jumps. The jumps are performed with relatively stiff knees, and it's mostly focused through the ankle. And it's very similar to like jumping when you're skipping. So I guess I always cue the athlete to minimize the time on the ground and to try and bounce up as high as possible. And then from that data, basically it takes the average of the best 5 out of those 10 jumps. So we look at how much time they're spending on the ground, and also how much time they're spending in the air. And what it's measuring is basically the athlete's stretch shortening cycle capacity. So basically how quickly the athlete can transition from, I guess, absorbing force to producing force. So obviously in a lot of sports, those actions tend to be quite prevalent. Even in things like boxing, reactive strength, I guess, is quite important in like changing direction and things. So I guess for boxing, you have to be able to change direction quickly to evade punches, create angles, all that kind of stuff. So from our data as well, we've found that the RSI figures are definitely elevated in the striking populations. I think just due to the nature of the sport, they're very like bouncy and springy in nature. If you think about grapplers or I guess MMA, a lot of those guys, even in MMA, they come from like a big wrestling background as well. So you find that they're more. You find that the values are higher in terms of the strength department, but in terms of the RSI, velocity takeoff for the CMJ, those values are definitely elevated in the striking population. In terms of how people can train it, so to be honest, we use a lot of plyometric training. I know a lot of fighters are jumping on like powerlifting programs or like bodybuilding programs. And yeah, even a lot of obviously the information is getting a lot better for combat sports, but yeah, even a lot of our guys who are coming in, they had very little experience with plyometrics, just doing simple things like a counter movement jump or a squat jump. They actually tend to struggle with it quite a bit. So that's where our coaching comes in and things, but ultimately, yeah, we're looking at, if you were looking to build some reactive strength qualities, then definitely including things like plyometrics can be useful for the athlete. Now, obviously, we need to keep in mind as well the time of the competitive period for the combat athlete. So, for example, in our general prep period, we use a lot of extensive-based plyometrics, just generally to build capacity through the connective tissues like the tendons and ligaments, and also just to prepare them for more intensive blocks. We have like a very, progression-based system here at Ethos as well. So if we're using like some extensive-based exercises where they can get countless amounts of reps in, we can use progressions and make that more, intensive in nature later on in their program. But just adjusting like little subtle things such as using like a band-resisted variation or a band-assisted variation. So yeah, those are just some ways that you can develop reactive strength.
Nice. In your experience then, because obviously from the profiles or the data you've collected, you see, say, grapplers, because of the nature of the sport, they tend to be stronger. They don't have that much of that reactive strength. Do you still find that it's useful to still develop that quality, say, maybe a jiu-jitsu person listening, even though the sport doesn't require or have that requirement, I guess, within it, unless maybe you're playing a more wrestling dominant style jiu-jitsu kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately like for me, I still like training a lot of the different physical qualities. Like I like including them in like different components in every program. But in terms of like the amount that you need to do, I'd say for a jiu-jitsu athlete, it's probably not as necessary to have, it'd be a bonus to have good reactive strength, but at the same time, it's like, I guess ultimately, like, it might make you a better athlete, but at the same time, the whole concept of like, the fact that jiu-jitsu is very technically focused as well. I guess the technique is, you look at, I think there was a guy called John Danaher, obviously, like, I think he talked about on the Let's Streaming podcast, he was saying like, when you look at like the podium finish of like a major jiu-jitsu competition, like they're all different sizes. So it's like one of those sports where like, I guess how athletic you are or how big you are, it all comes down to like the technique itself and how skilled. It's like one of the most skill dominant sports there is. But yeah, I'd say some, like with our jiu-jitsu athletes, we do include components of like reactive strength, but I guess they're more focused, rather like with the plyometric stuff. I guess you can categorize it with like, I guess your shorter contact plyometrics and your longer contact plyometrics. So I guess your shorter duration plyometrics, they're more tendon focused, using that elastic energy from the tendon. Whereas I guess your longer plyometric work, they're more muscular focused. So I guess in terms of the grappling side of things, I think using some of the longer duration-based plyometrics would be useful because there's a bit of that muscular contribution as well. So you can develop your ability to be producing large amounts or large quantities of force over a constrained period of time.
Nice. I haven't had many, I guess, coaches come on that work with jiu-jitsu athletes, but I guess mainly because boxing and MMA stuff's professional, so there's money in that, money to spend on coaches and stuff. Obviously, jiu-jitsu isn't, I guess, professional as such, even though obviously you've got some of the guys at the top making a lot of money, but it's not professional like some of the other combat sports. So it'll be actually good that you maybe dive into a little bit of maybe how you design, I guess, strength training programs for the jiu-jitsu athlete. I know it's a very general question, but maybe if you want to cover just a general overview of how a training program would look, maybe for a normal jiu-jitsu schedule, like training schedule, and then maybe as they're leading towards a competition, how maybe that might change.
So, yeah, with our programming here, I guess for me, with our general prep phase, it's really like capacity focused. So with our resistance training side of things, we tend to include things like high volumes just to develop good muscle mass. Obviously that's I guess important in jiu-jitsu as well. General strength, you need to have that good baseline strength, and at the same time, including things like some general power work as well. So Olympic lifting derivatives are useful, I find. Just like a hang clean shrug, or like like I said before, like a loaded jump. Those kinds of things are really useful. I guess in general prep periods where you can sort of those exercises, I guess, aren't really like complex in nature. And then as they transition closer to competitions, we might make some of those contraction types a little bit more specific. So and positions as well. So we utilize a lot of like staggered stance work. So if you think about a jiu-jitsu athlete, especially when they're in stand-up, for example, they're in that staggered stance position, ready to take the opponent down. So we use a lot of things like hand-supported safety bar split squats is a great way to sort of train, I guess, maximal strength in a staggered stance position, and you can pretty much do like a full body exercise as well, because you're sort of using your arms as well to help you up, and you can really load it up, and it also eliminates the stability factor too. So we use a lot of that. We do a lot of staggered stance work with jumping as well, to develop the power in those positions. In terms of some of the strength work, we tend to we like to transition it more to like, I guess, your longer isometric holds, upwards of like 10 to 20 seconds, training that ability to be able to, grip and hold things. For example, even like doing things like a gi chin-up. We have a gi here at the gym. We chuck it on the bar, and they're working on, their grip strength with the gi whilst doing like a strength exercise. So
nice.
That, in terms of resistance training, that's sort of how we cover it. And then obviously in terms of some of the accessory work, we find, I guess having good groin strength is quite important as well. So there always tends to be a thread of just some groin accessory work. And yeah, that's definitely found in some of our force frame data as well. We look at the adduction and abduction strength. We find, jiu-jitsu athletes have about a 1.14 ratio. So that means they're significantly stronger with their groin squeeze, so squeezing in, than pushing out abduction. So yeah, we tend to include that as an area of robustness. Also, just some like general elbow work, like tricep stuff I think it's useful, especially if getting caught in like arm bars and things. I think having that good arm elbow strength is really important, and also like a lot of unilateral work as well, just to ensure that the athlete minimizes the chance of injury and things like submissions from like the lower body as well. And then in terms of the conditioning side of things, so again, just a pretty, I guess, traditional progression. So like for me, I like developing that aerobic base further out from competition. And then as we get closer towards the competitions, we tend to transition it more to your anaerobic energy systems. We'll do things like, doing a short sprint on a watt bike or a salt bike, and then they transition into some rest work. But with that rest work, they make it specific to their sport. So we do a lot of like shadow grappling or shadow wrestling within those rest breaks as well. And then they'll interchange between those two activities. So they'll go through, for example, like a 10-second sprint into just some shadow grappling work where they can really visualize what they want to do in the lead up to the competitions. And they can work on little techniques and things that they're looking to improve on for their competition as well. In saying that, a lot of the times, especially with our amateur grappling guys, and same with our amateur boxers, you tend to find that they're competing quite regularly as well. So that's also a big consideration, which is why sometimes this periodization, like what I've described at the moment, is like a periodization model that we use for some of the higher level grapplers, where they might have a big event or a big competition, and we have that time to sort of plan it out. But sometimes you got amateur boxers or amateur grapplers who are competing like almost every week. So for me, in that instance, that's where the programming changes, and I like to use like a vertical integration approach, where I'm including little doses of like your strength, power, speed work, little doses of conditioning as well within the week. And then generally for those athletes, they're pretty consistent in the gym. So you'll find that if they're training for the whole year, they can gradually build those qualities over a longer period of time. And I guess, another consideration as well is also how they pull up from those competitions as well. So we have some guys who do jiu-jitsu competitions. They have, upwards of 6 to 7 matches, which is crazy in one day. So the next week might have to be a significant like deload week as well. So there's a lot of considerations around training the amateur guys as well. Like it's not always like the sort of a lot of the time. I guess on the internet and stuff, they have all those periodization models, but it tends to be for like the real high level professional fighters, where you can have like your general prep, specific prep, fight camp period. But a lot of the time with the amateur guys, which is pretty much makes up the majority of the combat sport population, they're competing quite regularly. So that makes my job as a strength and conditioning coach very interesting as well, because I have to adapt. I'm always adapting programs on the fly. I'm gonna come back to that bit about the amateur fighters with the week schedule. But first, obviously, you mentioned about the watt bike sprint and then like the shadow wrestling. There's actually a good paper that was published. I think it was this month or last month, and they did jump squats, loaded jump squats.
paired with like low-level jiu-jitsu drills, and they found it was basically the physiological response was similar to a sparring session, but a high neuromuscular load. So obviously you're getting a little bit of that peak power stuff in there too.
Yeah, right.
So that's interesting. That you guys are basically doing that anyway, doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned about the groin squeeze and the hip external rotation. So you mentioned you have a ratio there. Do you have a ratio that I guess you guys are aiming to be at, or you found maybe is best regarding, I guess, reducing the risk of injury? And do you do anything, I guess, for external rotation? And because it is, I guess, because the ratios are so close?
Yeah. So with the ratios, we tend, like I said before, we tend to find that, jiu-jitsu guys are very like adductor focused as well. So at the same time, they also need to train sort of the adduction as well. So we use things like, reverse Copenhagen's as well with the training, so the outside of the leg. Unfortunately, one machine that I would like to have here as well would be like just a standard like abduction machine. I think that'd be quite useful. Just to train like general strength in terms of like
good girl, bad girl.
Yeah, yeah. Because obviously, I've recently been to Europe and I had all these machines that we don't usually have here, and I was experimenting with all. I was experimenting with like the sort of the glute extension machine. Heaps of different machines. And the abduction one was quite a nice one. But I think it'd be useful just to develop some general strength for both the adductors and the abductors. But other than that, I think a lot of the time, we use a lot of reverse Copenhagen progressions to train sort of the abduction work as well. Okay. And then also like sometimes we use like banded work with just a simple like leg reductions as well. That can be quite useful for that. But in terms of the ideal ratios, I think having a good balance, like a ratio of 1 means that you're sort of equal. So I think jiu-jitsu, I think it's important to have a little bit stronger for your groins. I think it's necessary for just be a little bit more specific. But and even in MMA, in striking, a lot of the time it's more like internal rotation, stress through the groin. So I guess some ways you can work on that specific quality would be doing. We've been playing around with some like single leg RDL variations with like some rotation. We find that helps sort of bias that internal rotation of the hip, and also get some loaded strength at the same time. And same thing with split squats as well. So split squats, if you do a split squat and you rotate towards that front leg at the same time, we tend to find that's sort of pretty similar to when you throw a strike, you find that if you're orthodox fighter, you find that if you're throwing a right cross, you find that there's a bit of stress for the groin. That's sort of what we're training there as well. Developing the sort of endurance and capacity to be able to handle those kinds of contractions. Some of the other work we've been doing on the floor strength.
That's some good.
Yeah, so we also have done. We've been our testing battery. We like testing some shoulder rotation strength, so external and internal rotation. And sort of an interesting thing that I found with it was the fact that the majority of fighters are orthodox, and we found that like the left-sided values for both external and internal rotation are significantly weaker than the right-sided. So I guess that was an interesting sort of thing that I found. I think it's a lot of the time potentially maybe the fighters coming in a little bit fatigued. So this is I'm talking about strikers and sort of MMA athletes who do some kind of striking. So potentially, they're coming in. They're obviously throwing out that jab quite a bit. So obviously there's some high stresses going through the shoulder joint there. So potentially that's potentially a reason why some of those values are decreased on the left side compared to the right. But I'll probably have to dive into a little bit deeper. But that's sort of interesting thing that I found with that.
Yeah.
And also with neck strength, we do some neck strength testing as well. Now obviously that's a pretty important component of most combat sports. good neck strength has been shown to reduce the likelihood of concussions in striking-based sports. Obviously, in grappling, you're getting people having their arm around you, trying to choke you out, and obviously those torsional forces there are very high as well. So having good neck strength is super important, and I like to profile that as well. So I usually compare that to their body weight. And in terms of some of the interesting things that I found with that, so again, grappling and MMA fighters tend to have the strongest necks, and then you find that the strikers tend to have weaker necks compared to those guys. But I think that's, again, due to the nature of the sport. I think in terms of like wrestling, they're always pushing or applying head pressure on the chest or on the shoulder to keep the opponent down or to secure the position. So I think that's the potentially the reason why.
Yeah. It's interesting. If you go back and listen to the podcast with Gary Turner, so his research group is essentially disputing the fact that neck strength reduces the risk of concussion. And it's really interesting the way he explains it on there and kind of the theory behind it, the research they're doing. Because it made me be like, oh shit, so all this research now, the few papers that have come out now kind of with these observational, almost like retrospective studies, kind of just gathering subjective feedback and then comparing it to neck strength and then saying, okay, it reduces concussion because these people didn't have it. So he's saying like a lot of the data, or a lot of the papers being published are almost cherry picked within those journals. And then his theory is actually the same with Seth Linetsky, who's done a lot of the boxing punch research as well. They actually have the same theory on this, and they haven't talked to each other, which is quite interesting. And that's how essentially, if you have a stronger neck and you get hit, obviously you reduce the deceleration of the head, but that means all the force goes through the brain. Instead of if your head moves, it kind of dissipates around the head, so it doesn't all go through the brain, which I think is pretty interesting. And Seth was telling me the other day that that's his theory of why you see more knockouts in the heavyweight division, because mass doesn't equal more force and more impact force on punches, but the fact that you're bigger, so you generally have a bigger head and a bigger neck, the head doesn't move as much when you get hit. So his theory is with heavyweights, they get knocked out because the head and neck kind of stops the head moving and the brain takes most of the impact, which, man, it's interesting stuff. Like, I'm just waiting. Hopefully some more research comes out on it, but it's always awesome and interesting to hear kind of both sides of that area of, hey, is neck strength, like, are we doing a good thing or a bad thing, making, strikers' neck stronger, or, it's, we don't know yet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, all the research I've basically read is looking at the reductions in risk of concussion. But yeah, it's always good to keep up to date with the research. I'll definitely have to dive into that.
Same here.
It's that's really cool. Yeah.
But yeah, I'll link to that podcast anyway. But I want to come back to the amateur jiu-jitsu guys. So you mentioned guys that maybe are competing often. There might be some people listening to this. How does your week look then for someone who competes, I guess, often? And maybe you want to define what often is with your what you have there. But let's maybe look at, okay, they've just competed, they've done 7 matches, what that deload week might look like, if anything's going on at all, and then what kind of like a normal training week looks like when they're competing often.
Yeah, so when they're competing often, the first thing that's really important is communication between myself and the athlete to really keep myself updated on actually what's going on with their week and also how they're preparing. So in terms of the programming itself, within those training weeks, sometimes if it's a competition that they've just signed up to like a week before, then the training doesn't really change that much because they just wanted to get a few competitive rounds in. But for some of your more major competitions, I guess the week changes a little bit. So we tend to prime them up a little bit more. So we have like things like primer weeks where they're just completing mostly explosive based exercises. And the sessions are pretty short in nature. They probably take like half an hour, 40 minutes max, and they'll only complete like 2 sort of resistance training sessions during the week, and they won't complete any conditioning. That's if they have a lot of matches lined up for that particular weekend. Let's say they've come back from a weekend where they've had a lot of matches, then we do like a sort of a regen program, and then we find that with the programming for the regen program, it tends to be, I guess, really low intensity in nature, low load as well, just because they're going to be like pretty sore and banged up from if they're competing in that many matches. So their lifting is generally quite easy during that week. And in terms of the structuring of the week, in terms of their technical training, so they'll generally do their harder sessions earlier in the week, and then they'll taper it off towards competition. They'll do like those sessions just before the competition. They'll tend to keep those, I guess, higher intensity, but shorter in duration. Again, the whole sort of concept of priming the athlete for the competition. So keeping intensity high, but just lowering the volume to ensure they feel like sharp and ready to go.
Yeah, no, that makes sense as well, obviously, with the priming as well. And I guess jiu-jitsu athletes, I guess most combat athletes train probably more times a week than most other sports, especially at the amateur level. Like you'll have guys in the gym, 4 to 6 times a week, if not more, depending if they're doing double days or not, going to go do jiu-jitsu. So then how are you balancing, I guess, what's happening in the gym with the amount of, I guess, hours and days these guys are training on top of them having to work as well? Is there maybe like a little, I guess, formula, some kind of guidelines that people can kind of follow to help them with that?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess a lot of the time when some of our guys come into our gym, they want to train strength training like 4 or 5 times a week, plus their technical training, which I guess, it's the whole mindset of the combat athlete, right? They just want to work harder than their opponents. And there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, I think when you explain to them, like, strength training is sort of like a supplement, like, it would improve their physical performance, but you actually don't really need that much to actually get the benefits from it. I think it's like they always go, it's sort of like a realization moment for them where they go like, oh yeah, that sort of makes sense. Like I tell them, you only maximum, like most of the guys here, they're only really doing like twice a week strength training, and the sessions only go for about an hour. They'll complete like a couple of main lifts, and then they'll go into some accessory work. That usually takes about an hour. Keeping it within like 3 to 4 sets is generally reasonable for someone training, 2 times a week for strength. I think you can get some good benefits with that, provided they're training with the right loadings and right intensities and things. That's sort of how I'd control. Like obviously, a lot of the time as well, like with the fighters, a lot of them actually here in Australia, a lot of them work in the trades, so they would do like carpentry or air conditioning, roofing, all that kind of stuff. So they're already working like pretty intensive jobs as well. So sometimes they're coming in at like 5 a.m. in the morning. They barely have gotten any sleep as well. Like I've had guys who come in and be like, they've done night shifts, for example, and they've come in and said like, House, like, I've already had 3 hours sleep. I'm like, I think like in those instances, I've just told them to go home, like go get some sleep, because like the training you're going to get today is probably not going to be worthwhile. You know what I mean? So, and we have the other side of the spectrum where they're coming in after a hard day of work at 6, 7 p.m. at night, and they want to do a training session as well. So, a lot of the times, that's why having like a coach, especially for like if you're a combat athlete as well, having a coach, have a strength coach like that who can talk to you about these things and modify things on the fly. So it's super important, because if you're just doing these things by yourself, you might potentially think that you can do it, and then you end up overshooting it, and you're just going to be like completely sore and banged up for your technical training. So I think that's sort of if you have the access to a coach, I think that's sort of where the value is. Obviously the coaching as well, but I think a lot of the time it has to do with the loading too. Like if you're doing it by yourself, a lot of the time you can really go stupid with some of the exercises and really overshoot it. Whereas in this environment, we're always keeping an eye out. We're always talking to athletes, subjectively checking in, just to see how they're feeling and see whether they can actually complete some of the things that have been planned for them as well. So, but yeah, the whole thing of there's always a plan, but at the same time, the plan, it's just there as a structure. It's not really like a set structure. Like you always have to modify things in this sort of context. Yeah.
Have you found there's a difference, or you need to modify things? Like from my personal experience, I can lift before jiu-jitsu. Doesn't matter. I can lift directly before jiu-jitsu, and then I'm like, it feels me like on the mats. I feel really good. But if I train jiu-jitsu, say midday or late morning, and then I go lift in the evening, man, I feel absolutely fucked. And doesn't like my knees are like sore trying to do things. I'm like, man, like lifting after like doing morning jiu-jitsu sucks. So is there maybe, I'm sure you have guys that maybe morning jiu-jitsu or midday jiu-jitsu and they have to come in the evening, or I don't work a physical labor job, so maybe these guys are just used to it. But I guess, have you had to play around and modify things in that instance? And if not, is there maybe recommendations you would have for people listening that do maybe have to train jiu-jitsu in the morning and then weights later in the evening?
Yeah. Look, yeah, it is a tough one. I think, you got to keep in mind the work schedules of people. A lot of the guys are students as well. They got really big study schedules, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, obviously the schedule you described is probably what I term like an optimal schedule. Like I've done that myself, where I've trained before. I find that my resistance training sessions tend to be a lot better before my technical training. I feel like after technical training, you've had people, all like sweaty people, just trying to choke you out or trying to bash you up, and you just feel absolutely smashed afterwards. Like lifting it's pretty tough. Like it is definitely a big mental battle. But I guess if you like a lot of the guys, like they sort of have to manage their work and their study. Like doing resistance training, doing some kind of resistance training is still doing better than like no resistance training. So again, in those instances, you'd have to be modifying or keeping in mind what they're doing outside of their training here at the gym. So I think that just comes with having a good relationship with the athlete, understanding really what they do outside, and and then modifying it from there. For those guys,
I will say as well, like.
So you go.
No, I was just going to say quickly that I will say, I think in terms of the different, I guess, martial arts, you got striking, grappling, MMA. I think grappling is one of the only ones that does really well where you can lift first. Obviously, if you're doing some stupid high volume bodybuilding, like just chest on that day, then that's going to obviously fuck you up, and you shouldn't be running that kind of program anyway. But if you're doing like a well-rounded strength power program, doing that stuff before grappling works really, really well. Whereas with other sports, maybe striking things, depending on the volume you're kind of doing, it doesn't marry up so well as well. So that's something to always keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. I think the nature of the sports is like completely different. I think, jiu-jitsu, you can sort of like the rounds are way different. Like it's, I guess with the striking, like it's very, very much explosive based sort of actions. And then if you're doing like a training session before it, and you're doing like you're maxing out on weights and things, and then you're going into that, you're not gonna have that same force output as if you're just going into it fresh. But yeah.
I just want to touch on, as it comes to the end of this, that you mentioned there are some physical performance tests that don't correlate well together. Do you want to maybe run through some of those and maybe kind of your take on what that means in terms of training?
Yeah, so I think with the whole weak correlation thing, so one thing that I haven't really used much is the dynamic strength index. And the reason why is because when I first started investigating it here, I I tended to find that like even though some of the guys who were getting like really low values with an isometric mid-fly pull, for example, they were still like lifting quite heavy in the gym. Like they were strong athletes, but then the DSI was saying like they needed to work on their strength, which didn't really make sense to me. And then likewise on the opposite side of the spectrum, where like the sort of DSI was telling me like this guy needs to work on ballistic strength, but like you look at them in the gym and they just be like super explosive, and like it just the sort of data just didn't really make sense. So I've sort of tended to go away from that. So in terms of like how that's needed, that's like I guess an example of that. Like the fact that say something like an isometric mid-fly pull, it might not, I guess, relate to your strength your lifting strength. So even though you might have a high isometric mid-fly pull, I think because some of the stuff that you're doing in the gym, there's still like a bit of a skill element to it. Like there's a skill element to lifting too. So even with the isometric mid-fly pull, like there's an optimal technique to do it. So if you've never done it before, then potentially that might be a reason why the isometric mid-fly pull is coming up at a lower value, but you might have had experience lifting in the gym. So your joint angles and how you're setting up for those exercises are going to be a lot stronger, which therefore means that you're able to lift heavier. But based on our data, we found, isometric mid-fly pull doesn't really carry well to things like a trap bar deadlift or a back squat. And the same thing with like counter movement jump and a back squat as well. Doesn't really match up with like higher values for one test into stronger values for your main lifts.
That's interesting because most people will say to jump higher, you should squat more. But what you're saying is that the correlation is quite weak. So getting stronger in the squat might not translate that well into jumping higher and vice versa.
Yeah. I think there's some research as well on like doing partial rep style squats as well versus full range squats, and whether or not that which one is, I guess, more optimal for improving jump height. I think there was a study, I can't remember who was by, but they found that like the group that was doing the quarter squats actually improved their jumping performance significantly than the group that was doing the full range squats, which is a really interesting finding as well, in terms of like how I guess people can train for power. In terms of like, I guess with the if you explain in more like combat sports specific context, I guess that's where reducing range of motion might be useful as they get closer to the fight camp to make them feel more explosive. Whereas in those earlier periods or out of competition periods, that's where I like to include more sort of full range of motion exercises as well. So there's a time and place for each.
Yeah, for sure on that. Does that mean, I guess, because maybe, I guess, counter movement jump or the vertical jump is something that you use often for assessments, and maybe it's one of your KPIs. Does that mean that you lean more towards doing the trap bar deadlift over the squat because of that correlation, or you still kind of use them evenly because, hey, you're still looking at maybe the eccentric loading on the squatting, or you want to still have that squat pattern in there?
Yeah, for me, I still like having the squat pattern in there. I feel like the trap bar deadlift is like the joint angles like are more specific to more like hip dominant base muscles, whereas the squat you can really make that more knee dominant, especially if you change the positioning of the bar or use a different implement like a safety bar or something. I still like keeping a thread of like a squat, like a big lower body lift, and also like a big upper body lift, and then like a velocity based lift as well. I like including those sort of lifts within a combat athletes program, regardless of their testing results. Like obviously the testing results do dictate some of the programming, but a lot of the time most combat athletes just need to work on the really basic things, like developing general strength, speed, power, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
That's good. I mean, I think most people listen to this would do well with just that advice. Just to most people who have very low training age in the gym, just get generally stronger in some of the basic lifts, and then you can look to maybe do some other fancier stuff on top of that once you've got a good little base of strength.
Yeah, for sure. There's all different types of fancy exercises out there that obviously social media is it's gone through the roof now, and I guess athletes are using that more to see what higher level guys are doing. But a lot of the higher level guys are doing just some insane things that aren't obviously they're still very successful in what how they're performing, but at the same time I feel like some of the things are very social media focused. They just post it to get a ton of likes, as opposed to doing things that are actually going to benefit the athlete. So that's sort of my take on the whole fancy exercise.
Yeah, so much of it's just straight bullshit. It's. I mean, you can go back and I've said it many times on the podcast, and to anyone who reads my emails and stuff, it's often a lot of the top athletes are there not because of what they do, but despite what they do, and you'll see it in every single sport. The top 0.00001% are there because they are genetic freaks and have just crazy talent. I have a theory that the top guys are just hyper responders to everything. That they hit the gym doing whatever, they just build muscle like crazy. They're lean, they're hyper responders to the information they can take in about their sport, how they can react and kind of see their environment, their sporting environment, and basically anticipate. Like you look at John Jones, obviously one of the best. He can fuck off and do whatever and come back and still beat most people. And that's just that ability to be able to understand the sport so well that it doesn't matter what the hell they're doing outside of their sport. They're going to make it regardless.
Yeah. I think one thing that people tend to sort of underestimate is definitely the genetic part of it. Some people that come in here, I'm just amazed at just their genetic build. They're just so explosive or so strong, and they just built they're just built for that. So that's always there's always a question of how much can you actually train the athlete to actually get to those kinds of really top elite levels as well. So,
yeah, for sure. Well, we've covered quite a bit on this podcast. Thanks for coming on, Haoson. But are you active anywhere on social media or anything where anyone can follow you?
Yeah, so for me, I'm pretty active. Or I wouldn't say I'm pretty active, but I try to be active on Instagram. So my handle is coach_how, so you can follow me there. That's pretty much where I post the majority of my content. I post a lot of my content. I tend to tailor it to athletes. I feel like coaches already know enough. I think a lot of athletes might not know some optimal techniques. That's why I like focusing on them more. That's majority of my content is purely focused on that, just educating athletes on some things that we're doing here at the gym. But I do sometimes post some more scientific stuff as well for the coaches, especially about data. So, that's where you can follow me. But it was great to
nice. So
be on the podcast as well. So appreciate you for inviting me on.
No, thanks for coming on, and anyone listening, make sure you go follow Haoson on Instagram, show him some love there, and I appreciate you coming on. And hopefully, anyone listening took a lot out of this. Obviously, I'm going to link up Haoson's Instagram also in the description. So thanks, Haoson. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, James.